thank you to Prime Minister and Finance Minister. I assure him that my clarifications won't be with an eye on an election rally. Let me just take 2 points the Prime Minister made in his speech with regard to some points I raised in my speech. First, on the question of climate vouchers for individuals who are private household residences. I think the irony here is the cost of living affects people across the board, including those in private dwellings. And giving them assistance also makes the point that the issue cuts across all segments of society, which was the meta point that I made when I addressed the subject before I made that point. The second issue, Finance Minister, I beg your pardon, Prime Minister asks about where is the turbocharging on the matter of inflation. I took reference from the reply that was given by the government in early 2024. I think it was referred to by Member Saktiandi as well, where the MAS set out a projected number with regard to core inflation for 2024. It was 2.5 to 3.5%. And it assessed, or it estimated, that the goods and services tax rate increase would contribute slightly less than 1% to core inflation. So if you take that figure with the lower end of the estimate at 2.5%, that's 40%. And that is the contribution of the GST hike. That's how I read it, hence the term, hence my characterization of turbocharged. On the matter of the third subject, which was covered by the Prime Minister in his roundup speech, if I can just bring back what was mentioned at last year's budget when the then Prime Minister was then Finance Minister, brought up in his roundup speech. He said he confirmed that OECD estimated that the investment hubs, Singapore being one of them, would stand to see corporate tax revenue gain ranging from 5 billion to 11 billion, but that on a more conservative estimate, this was 2 billion to 11 billion, and that increases would only materialize from fiscal year 2027. MOF was making assessments and detailed projections and would come back with detailed revenue updates. It has been a year so far. So far, we have not received these updates, and I hope Minister can share with us what these numbers are. In 2023, I think Prime Minister also spoke about, towards the end of his speech, about the occasional papers, and it released, MOF released an occasional paper in 2023 covering medium-term fiscal outlook up to financial year 2030, but that paper did not include corporate income tax revenues that would accrue arising from BEPS. The Finance Minister said also in his last budget reply speech, and I quote, that the occasional paper that we published last year may not be so occasional after all. We will keep on updating it from time to time so that everyone will have a sense of how our fiscal trends are unfolding, not just on a year-to-year basis, but over 5-year and 10-year horizons. Can I confirm that MOF will be releasing this occasional paper on the medium-term outlook with BEPS reflected in its projections shortly? And finally, sir, in the course of our last budget debate as well, I remember a senior PAP backbencher saying that he was surprised, or he was pleasantly surprised actually, that what he had seen only 2-3 weeks earlier in the course of the motion that we had in Parliament on the reserves, he had hoped that our corporate tax collections would overtake NIRC within a 10-year time frame. And merely 2 weeks later, that overtaking had occurred. NIRC became the second top revenue source, and corporate income tax overtook it. And the Prime Minister said that it was not so clear-cut whether that trajectory would continue, and that it was too early to tell whether it can be sustained, so we will continue to monitor. Can I ask the Prime Minister whether there's some clarity now on that point? Thank you.
Prime Minister. So I thank the Leader of the Opposition for the opportunity to clarify these points. On climate voucher, I should just reiterate, I understand his explanation. I was just making the point that this is not a cost of living support measure, climate vouchers. It's meant to encourage everyone to go for energy efficiency. Members have asked for this, the residents themselves have asked for this, and we think that in the broader scheme of things, it's a move we can make. I mean, Workers' Party is free to object to it if you feel like it's not worth doing, but and if you feel that you don't want to support this, please say so. But we think it's a worthwhile move to make to encourage energy efficiency. On the turbocharging of inflation and the explanation that Mr. Singh provided, I think he would have also, if he had read the reply he cited, read other MAS statements, which stated very clearly the impact of the GST on price levels is once-off, and it is transitory. The impact of inflation is transitory. And the explanation he gave that the impact of GST on inflation, the once-off effect or the transitory effect is high as a proportion of the base inflation actually doesn't make sense, because if I take that view, then I really should be raising GST at a time of very high inflation. Then the proportionate impact would be quite small, because the 1% on a very high inflation base means that there is very little impact. But if that's the case that the Workers' Party feels, then really there should not be any concern about the timing of the GST increase. The third set of questions, they are related, around corporate tax. Let me explain what the situation is. Go back to the beginning of the decade when we started looking at tax revenues. Actually, at that time, there was no certainty at all that corporate income tax would go up, even with BEPS, because remember, the stated objective of BEPS, not even this explicit stated objective, one of it is to transfer and reallocate profits to market jurisdictions. Large economies, markets. We are going to be impacted by that very move. We would have profits reallocated from us, and we would be suffering. It has not worked out, or it still hasn't been implemented, this part of BEPS, but that was the beginning, what they wanted to do. That's why we were concerned, and that's why we didn't think that we would be able to get more revenues from corporate income tax. Later on, BEPS evolved and people started talking about having a minimum corporate tax of 15% applied across all countries. Yes, but that didn't mean that competition would disappear and everyone would just operate with a 15% corporate income tax. As I have explained, even with that a consensus earlier struck on a minimum corporate income tax, countries were already carving out maneuvering space for themselves to introduce all sorts of different kinds of incentives in order to attract investments. This was the reality that we faced with. So even if the domestic top-up tax yields more revenue, we are very likely to have to also spend more to maintain our competitiveness. Thirdly, the situation today has gotten a lot fuzzier because the US has pulled out of the OECD consensus, and we have no clue at all how this will emerge in the coming years. And that's why it is so difficult to say, give us an updated projection. We don't even know what the global tax arrangement will be like in the next 1-2 years, given the unpredictabilities we face now. Even the Europeans are worried. The consensus has frayed. What is going to happen? What is the next move going to be? Will it be more tit-for-tat type taxes, or will there be some global cooperation? It is really unclear. And that's why we are unable to provide any immediate or any updates to our corporate income tax revenues from BEPS in the near term. But certainly, as the situation gets clearer, we remain committed to providing further updates on our medium-term fiscal position, including revenues from BEPS, if any, pluses or minuses, and we will continue to publish these figures. But in the meantime, we are fortunate that even before the domestic top-up tax, the minimum corporate income tax has kicked in, companies have started to do more substantial activities out of Singapore, and our corporate income tax collections have gone up. That's a big plus for us, but as I have explained, it's too early to tell whether this is a lasting trend. But whatever it is, it's good that we are in such a position, and we will make good use of the revenues to ensure that Singaporeans benefit, to ensure that we continue to advance our goals. Next, on the occasional papers, I mentioned it, that we will be committed to publishing and updating them. We are unable to, there are no significant updates that we have been able to make in recent time, given the very complex global situation. That's why we have not updated any, given an update to the OP recently. But as I have said just now, when we get better clarity around our revenue position in particular, we will certainly be committed to providing an update to the OP.
Sir, I appreciate PM's explanation that the progressive wage model is one approach, and indeed perhaps the government's preferred one, for uplifting wages at the lower end of the income distribution. But as I said in my speech, where I think the squeeze is felt most acutely is by those in the middle, those who are sandwiched by commitments to their parents and children, but who don't happen to work in one of the 8 sectors that the PWM currently covers. So the first question I have is, what is being done to help these workers realize wage increments that are commensurate both with their contributions to greater productivity and the high cost of living? Related to this, PM emphasized that skills upgrading and retraining is key to elevating nominal wages, and I do not disagree with this in principle. But as I explained in my speech, real wage gains over the past 5 years have not kept up with increases in productivity and the cost of living. So the question that begs to be asked is, how can the government assure Singaporeans who do choose to retrain and reskill and upskill that those efforts will ultimately be rewarded by actual wage increments when the unfettered labour market does not seem to already be doing so?
Prime Minister.
So we are focused not just on the lower wage workers. We are pushing their wages through progressive wages, workfare, and many other initiatives. But we are also focused on the middle income and on the broad middle to ensure that Singaporeans do enjoy continued real wage increases. Generally speaking, we have been able to achieve positive outcomes. I know Associate Professor Lim talked about the last 5 years of data where wages seem to lag behind productivity growth. But you can slice any short-term data over any shorter-term period and look at the lags, or when sometimes wages will be lagging behind, sometimes wages will be ahead of productivity. Certainly in the last 5 years, wages have not caught up with productivity, but if you look at the longer-term time frame, we want to ensure wages do match productivity increases, and it has been so. It has been so, and we will continue to ensure this remains. The best way to do that is to ensure a strong, vibrant economy, but not just leaving it to market forces alone, but to support workers with all the investments we are putting into Skills Future, which is not only benefiting the lower wage workers, but supporting the broad middle of our workforce. And that's why we are redoubling efforts, investing more in every worker through a whole range of incentives and schemes and programs, through working with the NTUC, our brothers and sisters in the labour movement, through the CTC grants, working with enterprises who are prepared to do workforce transformation. We are putting in place all the building blocks that are necessary to strengthen our Skills Future system and to make sure that Singaporeans continue to enjoy sustained real income increases.
Thank you, Speaker. Just one clarification, but a bit of a long one. I mentioned the point about the top-ups to endowment and trust funds, about how just in these 2 years we can set aside close to about 42 billion. I mentioned not in the context of earnings management of companies, but how if you look at in the context of transparency and the matching principle, in the sense that if you look at these top-ups to the funds, they are to meet our spending needs in the future. Similar to how, if you look at our Singa expenditure, our development expenditures, these are also spending that are meant for longer term needs and purposes. But in the sense that if you have the spending made from the endowment and trust funds, we get a lot less granularity versus the regular expenditures, which, those who go to the budget website can see the whole full heads of expenditure under the different ministries, under different spending categories. So in that context, under the whole premise of greater transparency and the matching of the expenses against the periods in which they are incurred, would the PM be able to share the rationale behind these? Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the funds that we've set up are for specific purposes. They are well established. We highlight what they are. And if there is a need for more information on how on the spending and expenditure associated with each of these funds, we will take a look at how we can put out more information.
Sir, I appreciate your indulgence. Just a quick clarification. A PM mentioned earlier on that had there not been a GST increase, we would have run a deficit over the past 2 years. I recall during our debate on the GST that the fiscal hole that would have been met by the GST increase would have been something in the order of 3.7 billion. I understand that last year we ran a very small surplus, but this year we appear to have run a significant surplus. So were GST receipts substantially larger than we expected this year?
Prime Minister.
Sir, I mentioned that we would have been in deficit FY24 and also 25 because of both GST, if we didn't do GST, and the unexpected upside in corporate income tax. So it's both factors, not just GST alone. As I said just in my budget statement, if we were to plan on previous assumptions for corporate income tax, it would be about 3+% of GDP. It's gone up to 4+% of GDP now. And when we plan for budget 2025, we have assumed a higher base. But without that unexpected increase on corporate income tax, without the GST rate increase, certainly FY25, based on whatever we are proposing to spend in the budget, would end up in the deficit.